Hello everybody. You are very welcome to the Smashing Times Arts and Human Rights radio show, where we explore all things arts, culture and human rights. You can find us here on Dublin South FM every Wednesday 6 to 7pm and at dublinsouthfm.ie. For the next hour, join me for fun, in-depth discussions on the arts for equality, human rights and diversity. A special thanks to Dublin South FM for supporting the show and to you, our listeners, for joining us. I'm your host, Mary Moynihan. We love hearing from you, so please get in touch on info@smashingtimes.ie or 087 22 14 245. Our feature artist interview today is with Féilim James, a poet, playwright and prose writer from Dublin, Ireland. His work has appeared in New Irish Writing, Acumen, Abridged and elsewhere. One of Féilim's poems was shortlisted at the 2024 Irish Book Awards, and he has received funding from the Arts Council of Ireland on 3 occasions. He's had 4 plays and 2 short films professionally produced, and Féilim is the editor of Tintreach, the Smashing Times Arts and Literary Journal, and the Smashing Times newsletter. Féilim is on the show today to chat with us about his work and also about Tintreach, the Smashing Times Arts and Literary Journal, and to talk about his role as editor of the journal and to talk about what he is looking for from artists who want to submit work to this journal. So today, before we get to Féilim, I want to chat about immigration and grief. So this is a topic that is of interest to me at the moment because I am losing a son to immigration. My 3rd son is heading to Australia for 2 years, and I'm experiencing the paradox of feeling a deep grief over his immigration while simultaneously experiencing happiness for him because of his independence and the fact he is setting out on an adventure. He is making his own way in life, and it reminded me of the James Joyce quote from the novel, The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And the quote is, "Welcome, O life. I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience, and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race." This quote comes from the character Stephen Dedalus, who makes the decision to forge his own destiny and become an artist. Now, my own son is not an artist, but I appreciate this quote because it speaks to me about the courage it takes to follow your heart, wherever it may lead. In the novel, Dedalus embraces life by rejecting the societal and religious constraints of his time. He vows to create a new independent consciousness through his writing, to rely solely on his own soul rather than the influences of external powers. And by doing so, he is choosing to step away from a sheltered, protected existence and enter the chaotic reality of experience. And that could be quite a brave choice to make. And though young, Dedalus sees himself as part of an ancient tradition, so he's connected, if you like, to his ancestors and to all who have come before him. And I think the phrase, forged in the smithy of my soul, it's a metaphor, likening the soul to a blacksmith's workshop, a place of hard work, fire and transformation. And I think in the novel, the young artist Dedalus is following his art and deciding to work hard and create art while simultaneously shaping, if you like, a new consciousness for himself. So making a new life for himself. And as the artist Joyce is saying, he's also seeing it as making a transformation to be his own person, but also a transformation for Ireland. The uncreated conscience of my race. Now that likely refers to Ireland's struggles at the time under British rule, Catholicism and the very conservative values that were around. So what you have here is an artist committing to break away from convention and to bravely choose the path of the artist and to help define his own consciousness and a new identity for him, as well as what it means to be Irish. Now, I like to talk about this because I often say I think it's very brave for artists to do what they do when they choose to follow the path of being an artist. Sometimes that path is not something we choose, it's something that we are drawn to, it's already there. But, you know, you are making a lot of sacrifices to be an artist today. Many of us do it because we love it. But I always think, well done to artists when you choose that. And when it comes to immigration, which is going back to my original topic, people choose that too, sometimes. there can be many reasons for immigration. In some occasions, particularly outside of Ireland, people are forced to immigrate, to flee from war and conflict happening around the world. They have no choice. And in those situations, people are forced to flee their homes because they are seeking safety and a chance to rebuild their lives in a safe and peaceful place. And that's why I always think it's very important that we are welcoming to people who come to our country seeking sanctuary. In Ireland, immigration, which is people leaving here and going abroad, now that has a slightly different character, if you like. So some people will leave in search of new adventures and opportunities, while others may immigrate because of a lack of economic choices at home. So if you go back in time in Ireland, that was something that was a huge experience here. My own father was forced to emigrate when he was 16, and he had to go to the United States after his own father died suddenly, and his mother, my grandmother, was left to rear 3 boys on her own. My father's leaving, I was told many years later, was like a wake, because back then when somebody emigrated across the ocean, you had very little chance of being in communication with them or possibly never seeing them again. And my father, they had this wake and he left. And I remember years later, my father, after he had returned to Ireland, he told me that he never wanted to emigrate, but he had no choice. He said he went so he could look after and provide for his family, for his mother and his younger siblings. He was the eldest. And when his father died, there was a duty on him to become, I suppose, the provider, if you like. And he chose to go, but yet had no choice in order to look after his family. So I think today, my own son now is immigrating and is leaving, and it is partly an adventure, which I think is very important. But what's interesting is we are starting to lose a lot of young people today, and I've been looking at this, and some of it may be to do with, yes, they're looking for an adventure, but many young people now are starting to leave because they're finding it difficult to live in Ireland. They're finding it difficult to become independent, to rent and move out of their parents' homes, or way too difficult to buy their own home. So buying a home is out of the reach of a lot of young people, particularly young people who are just out of college, even those who find a good job. The cost of living crisis is an issue for many people of all ages, and it is now playing a part of the reason why we are starting to lose people from Ireland again, and particularly to lose young people. Limited job prospects, financial challenges, they can push people to look elsewhere for a better future. And I think this is making immigration a very complex mix of both hope and necessity, if you like. I looked at the statistics from the CSO to see the number of Irish people leaving, and apparently it was around 35,000 in 2025, and this is an increase. And a third of immigrants in 2025 were young people aged 15 to 24. And as I was saying, research is indicating that while young Irish people often want to travel for new experiences, many are now leaving because of the rising cost of housing, the cost of living, the financial reasons that are causing them not to be able to have fully independent lives, to have access to affordable houses. That is now influencing younger people's decisions to immigrate. So, back to my own experience as someone who is losing a loved one to immigration. This paradox of feeling grief over an adult child's immigration is interesting because it is a paradox, because on the one hand you're feeling grief while simultaneously experiencing joy in their independence. And this is often referred to as silent grief, or what they used to call empty nest syndrome. And so what you have is two states of emotions coexisting. And now in my case, my son hasn't actually gone yet. So I am experiencing what I would figure out is an impending mourning over the loss of his presence. But I have been talking to a number of parents recently, and it's very interesting what I've been discovering, that many of them have spoken about being delighted at the independence of their young people, but then after they've gone, experiencing a profound sense of grief. So you're having the celebration of the new journey, and yet, on the other hand, you have the parents left behind who are experiencing what is a sense of loss. And for some parents, I've been discovering it can be loneliness, it can be a sense of isolation, and you often have parents starting to cover up their feelings. So, for example, they don't want to upset the person who is leaving. They don't want to upset the person when they start talking to them, because luckily today we can keep in touch through Zoom and different ways of connecting and speaking with each other. But research is indicating that parents, especially mothers in particular, still continue to feel a deep sense of grief when their children leave as young adults, that they're experiencing what is an absence and a sense of distance. And this sadness is going on, but yet, do you acknowledge it or not? And again, when I was speaking to a number of parents, they talked about this, about not being able to express what they were feeling. And this is interesting because I think it's important to find a way to express your emotions in a more open, honest and healthy way. So pretending there is no sorrow or grief involved, in a way, is to deny the reality of what is actually happening. There is a sense of loss. There's a gap or a space that opens up when someone you love has now moved on. And that gap is physical, but it's also emotional. And, you know, if you look at the research, you can see that this type of silent grief and the loneliness that it can bring can even impact on people's mental and physical health. So the message here, I think, is that this is an experience that many people are going through, and it's important to take care of yourself, to reach out for companionship, to take up new activities, even go to counselling if needed. And as I said, I have found myself facing this. And interestingly enough, what I have found myself doing is moving back to the arts. Now, I work in the arts and I am an artist, but I have found myself spending a little bit more time recently becoming involved in arts activities. For example, reading books and watching films. And I found myself turning to them. And I think that's part of my sorrow. That I'm reaching out to the arts. And we've often said here that the arts can be a great form of comfort and solace. So reaching out to the arts is definitely a path to follow. And what struck me too is this whole idea of the emotions of sorrow and grief on the one hand, and then on the other hand, a sense of joy. Now, this might seem strange because these seem like two opposite emotions. Grief on the one hand, or sorrow, and joy on the other. But I think it's important to let those two emotions live side by side. Joy and grief are not opposite emotions. They are in fact interconnected and can live side by side. I remember one time in my life when I was, many years ago, when we had experienced a tragedy, and I remember in the depth of my grief at one point, something came to me about the person, and I remember smiling and laughing out loud. And I remember being shocked, thinking that I had betrayed the person. But afterwards I realised that it was because of love that moment of laughter came. And in a way, it's like a moment of lightness to help you get through your grief. And I'm talking about grief here today in relation to if someone is leaving and going away. So there is joy, but yet there's sadness. But it's interesting how those two emotions live side by side. And I really like that idea, to let yourself, when you are grieving, to allow yourself those moments to feel maybe gratitude, to feel humour, to think about the happiness that you had. And it's like looking at it as a way of balancing out, if you like, the heaviness of grief, because joy regulates sorrow. Positive emotions during mourning can soften the edges. I love the quote I read somewhere. It says, it softens the edges just enough for you to keep breathing. Joy in the middle of grief can feel like a betrayal, but yet it's important because grief isn't a singular emotion, it's a landscape. And joy will pop up like wildflowers in the cracks. So let it through when you can. It helps make the loneliness easier. And I think that's really important. And interestingly, I'm going to talk about one of the books that I have found myself going back to. It was a book I read many years ago, and I found it the other day in my house because my daughter was reading it, and I picked it up and I started reading it again. Now, it's quite a dark book, yet it's also very life-affirming. So here's that paradox again. I talked about the paradox of joy and grief, and I'm now reading a book that has the paradoxical reflection of being dark yet quite life-affirming. And it's actually quite an extraordinary book. It's a memoir called When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. And this book came out in 2016. And Paul, at the age of 36, he was on the verge of completing a decade's training as a neurosurgeon when he was diagnosed with inoperable lung cancer. So one day, Paul was a doctor treating the dying, and the next, he was a patient who himself was dying. And he had studied brain surgery and was a very gifted brain surgeon. And interestingly, through his life, he had also studied English literature at Stanford University, and he always loved to write. So when he got his diagnosis, he decided to write about his experience as he attempted to live his life as fully as he could while he was dying. And the book, it's a very beautiful book. It weaves together his experiences as both a doctor and as a patient. And it explores the tension between science and philosophy, between ambition, the ambition he had becoming a brain surgeon, and the vulnerability you experience when illness takes over. And it's particularly a book about a search for purpose in life. And for him, it was a search for purpose in the face of his own inevitable death. And it's a book that looks at questions such as what makes life worth living in the face of death? What does it mean to live with death? And what decisions do you make while you still can? And in the book, he talks about he and his wife looked at the decision of having a child before he died. And that's an extraordinary story in its own right. And yeah, it's a book I found very powerful, very, very devastating and very moving. But yet it reminded me to appreciate life in all its sadness and beauty. And in that book, he is, of course, exploring the emotions of grief and joy and how he is living through his experience. So you have this he's very young at 37, facing terminal cancer. And in his book, he sees grief and joy coexisting with each other as emotions. And he often reflects on how they deepen each other. So he moved from being a doctor treating patients to become a patient himself. And he had to confront, on the one hand, the grief of losing his future. So his career, his time, his plans. But because he was losing them and the sorrow he felt, he started to realise how meaningful life was. And his grief was like a lens that helped him to become aware of the beauty of life. And he saw the beauty in his relationship with his wife, in the work he had been doing, saving other people's lives. And then when they chose to have a child, in the birth of his daughter, Katie. And the decision to have a child in the book, despite his illness, shows one of the memoir's strongest themes, which is joy as an act of defiance against grief and mortality. Paul Kalanithi died in 2025 at the age of 37 from lung cancer, but it is a wonderful book that I would highly recommend. And before I finish this part of the show, I want to give a big shout out. So on to a different topic now. This is a big shout out to Firhouse Community College, because last night I went to see a show they put on, the Transition Year Show. And it was a show that was full of joy. And I want to particularly comment on the joy that came from the audience as well. So the Transition Year students, fantastic students, put on a show called Thank You for the Musical. And the work done by the students was fantastic. There was a sense of comradeship, a sense of joy, and there was a sense of joy coming from the audience as well. It was a really special show. And I think the idea of musicals in schools where young people have the opportunity to work on stage and behind the scenes is fantastic. So a special shout out to Megan Doyle, the director, Emma Ray, the musical director, Emma Thornton, choreography, Michelle Carson, stage manager, Emmett O'Toole, design, and Maria Martin, business. And to all the students, well done on a fantastic show. And that brings us to our first break.
Broadcasting to South Dublin on 93.9. This is Dublin South FM.
Welcome back to the Smashing Times Arts and Human Rights radio show on Dublin South FM. I'm delighted to have in studio the writer Féilim James, who is editor of Tintreach, the Smashing Times Arts and Literary Journal, and also editor of the monthly Smashing Times newsletter. Féilim is here to chat with us about Tintreach, the Smashing Times Arts and Literary Journal, and his role as editor of that journal. And he's also going to chat about his own work as a writer and how this informs his work as an editor. Féilim is a poet, playwright and prose writer from Dublin, Ireland. His work has appeared in New Irish Writing, Acumen, Abridged and elsewhere. One of Féilim's poems was shortlisted at the 2024 Irish Book Awards, and he has received funding from the Arts Council of Ireland on 3 occasions. He has had 4 plays and 2 short films professionally produced. Féilim, you are very welcome to the Smashing Times Arts and Human Rights radio show.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be on.
Okay, Féilim. So before we chat about Tintreach, let's talk about you. How did you become involved in the arts? How did you become an artist?
Well, I started writing poetry through Irish initially and around the age of 15. And I started writing in English as well, but it was mainly Irish was my main focus. Then I started studying English literature and psychology in Trinity College. And over the course of the 4 years there in the undergraduate, I started writing more and more in English as opposed to Irish. I was still writing in Irish. And I also started to switch from poetry to fiction. So as time went on, fiction became my main focus, English language fiction. And I did a master's after that in what is now the University of Galway, master's in writing, studying under the likes of Mike McCormick. And yes, since then I've been out in the world writing, got a few Arts Council grants, a few plays on, and
making your way as a writer.
Making my way, yeah.
That's brilliant. I know you're a big fan of James Joyce as a writer, and I was talking earlier about a quote from him and, you know, the importance of choosing to be a writer and to work as an artist these days. Yeah. I think it's quite a brave choice for people.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's probably made a bit easier, especially in Ireland, in the fact that we do have funding available. I mean, you know, there weren't Arts Council grants in Joyce's early 20th century Ireland, but
I think he had patrons at the time.
Oh yeah, patrons. Where have they gone? We need to bring patrons back. That definitely turned out handy for Joyce. But no, yeah, it's a brave decision. You know, you're risking financial precarity by becoming an artist, but it is, you know, as long as you go into the career with that knowledge, you know, yeah, that it does require bravery. Yeah.
Okay, and it's like somebody said to me recently, in a way, you don't choose to be an artist; it chooses you, and sometimes you have no choice. But
absolutely, yeah. There's a degree of that, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's fantastic. And so you were lucky then to have studied English in Trinity and also to have studied creative writing on an MA in Galway. And would you recommend that for writers?
I'm definitely English literature. I definitely think you should study English literature because you have to be reading, you know, what is considered the greats in order to learn from it. You know, like I remember it's a different art form, but I used to play the fiddle a lot, the Irish traditional violin, and I remember my teacher saying you need to be listening to music 90, like the ratio of listening to playing should be like 9-1. So 9 parts listening, 1 part playing. So it's like you do have to immerse yourself in the art form. So I think studying English literature is, whether that be through formal education or yourself in your own time, because that's also an option. You know, I think that's essential in terms of creative writing masters. I do think they're useful. Yeah, no, I do think they're useful, but they mightn't be useful for everyone because not everyone's the same. You know, and naturally, plenty of the great writers today hadn't done that because it wasn't really a thing, but you know, it didn't harm them per se. But no, I think they are a good thing, and they're becoming better and better.
Excellent. Okay, so it's very good, and I hear what you're saying. I definitely think it's important for artists to study our craft, but equally to recognise you can study it whether it's in formal education or non-formal education. There's many different ways of learning. So you're working as an artist today. Tell me, what are you working on at the moment?
So I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm writing a novel that's more, I suppose, plot focused than some of my previous more literary experimental work. So I'm writing a novel called The Red God. It's kind of a folk horror novel with elements of crime. It's about a young psychology academic who spends her winter in a scenic Airbnb in the centre of Ireland and who unwittingly places herself in the orbit of a serial killer. So it kind of blends elements of folk horror and crime and draws on Irish folktales to weave a grisly story of surviving the supernatural.
Okay, sounds very dark and very interesting as well. You know, I'm the type of artist, I love dark stories. and
Same,
as long as there's character driven and lots of plots and lots of stuff going on.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
do you see yourself as having any particular area that you write in? You know, because as writers, we can be poets, we can write short stories, fiction. Do you specialise in one area?
So I do still write poetry. Absolutely, fiction is my main gig, but poetry, I write poetry as well, and I do write plays. I've had a few plays on, and playwriting is another love of mine. So multidisciplinary, I suppose. Someone once called me, and I realised it was probably the right word. But
because you're writing in different
because you're writing in different disciplines
within writing.
Within writing,
Yeah. And do you write non-fiction?
Sometimes, yeah. I haven't in a while, but I prefer to, because like a lot of non-fiction, and not to put down the genre or anything, but a lot of it naturally involves writing about your own life and kind of pouring your heart out and stuff. And I prefer to kind of fictionalize episodes from my own life so that I can have the freedom of, you know, not having to necessarily admit, okay, this is my confession. Do you know what I mean? Like, I can fictionalize something and say, well, these are the characters. And yes, I drew upon my own experience, but some elements are fictionalized, some are not. And that kind of gives you a protective layer, if you know what I mean, because talk about bravery, it's very brave what nonfiction writers do in terms of being so honest and candid about their own life and laying it all out there, and the vulnerability involved in that is admirable. But,
okay. Okay, interesting. Yeah, no, because actually a book I'm reading at the moment is it's about a writer writing the truth about his own life, or he's a brain surgeon, and I was talking about it earlier. And I think it could be interesting whether you write that personal way, which is making some brilliant work at the moment. But there's many different ways to write, which I think...
That's not When Breath Becomes Air, is it?
Yes, that's right.
What's the name of the author again? He's sadly passed away.
Paul Kalanithi.
Okay, yeah. And
it's a fantastic book. But as we're saying, there are many different ways to write.
Yes, we should give an overview of it. He was a brain surgeon who realised he had inoperable cancer in his 30s, and I think he did indeed decide to write kind of his life story.
Yes.
Before sadly passing away.
Yeah. No, because I was talking about that book earlier on the show.
Oh, okay, brilliant.
So tell me, you are, as you said, you're a fiction writer, but you're also the editor of Tintreach, the Smashing Times Arts and Literary Journal.
Absolutely, yeah.
So let's talk about Tintreach.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, as we said, a Smashing Times Arts and Literary Journal. It's a relatively new publication in the Irish art scene. It's published quarterly online, and it features work from across the artistic spectrum and combines up-and-coming voices with those of more established artists. It is a publication of Smashing Times, and it is proving very successful with a lot of submissions. So we are delighted to have you on as editor to talk more about the journal and maybe some words of advice to artists who want to submit to Tintreach.
Absolutely, yeah. So each edition of Tintreach includes 3 or 4 artworks by a featured artist interview, work by 3 other artists, usually with multiple artworks by each. And it appears in January, April, July and October each year. So there's Tintreach, I should explain, is the Irish for lightning, which for us symbolises the spark that animates art, making it striking and engaging. And so what kind of sets Tintreach apart as a publication is its openness to all art forms that can be read or viewed in page format. So we publish short fiction, non-fiction, visual art, poetry, plays, so that there's a lot of flexibility there, a lot of openness. And then the second thing is that we always publish more than one work by each writer in order to give them a bit more exposure than a normal journal publication would. With the exception of like short stories, because they're kind of long form anyway. But
okay, and you'd encourage all artists. Do you have to have work published already? Do you have to be experienced? Do you have to have been working as
you can be established, have books published, and we get submissions from people who've had many books published, and we get submissions from people who are just starting off, and both are equally welcome. We do like to emphasize that. We do like to spotlight emerging artists in particular. So, you know, if we get a strong submission from an emerging artist, it's, you know, it's absolutely, we're thrilled with that, and we hope to get it, to publish it.
Okay, so that's really important, that spotlight on up and coming artists.
Yeah.
And I always say an up and coming artist can be any age. You don't have to be young,
100%, yeah.
which is very important. And you often find too that there's many artists who may change art, change the type of art they make at certain stages in their life, depending on what's happening, or they come late to art, or they maybe move away from art and come back to it. So always encourage artists of any age to submit.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
And what are you looking for?
In terms of reviewing the submissions?
Yeah.
So we're looking at, artistic merit would be the, I suppose, primary requirement, you know. For example, a strong technical foundation, depth and complexity and originality. There's also, sometimes we have a theme, so naturally it needs to fit the theme.
And can you give me an example of some of the themes you've had?
Some of the themes we've had, yeah. So last July we had a theme, Voices of Peace, and the 4 successful artists became Voices of Peace artists at our annual Irish Arts and Human Rights Festival. So the theme was Voices of Peace. So it was really, you know, the themes are usually flexible. It was anything to do with the theme of peace, you know, in terms of a social kind of war-related aspect. But it could also do with, you know, inner peace. Peace is quite a broad, a thankfully broad theme. We've had other ones such as, slipping my mind now. What do we have? Arts and Human Rights. Which is kind of similar.
Okay, well, arts, and arts and human rights is part of the, I suppose, the focus of Smashing Times, who produce. So Smashing Times produced the Smashing Times Tintreach, Arts and Literary Journal, and arts and human rights is a big theme. Is it important that, because you often have editions which have no theme, so an artist, do they have to have a focus on human rights in their work in order to be published in Tintreach, or is it much wider or broader than that?
I think it absolutely helps if there's kind of a human rights dimension in terms of kind of socially conscious work. But I would say that all good art is sort of an affirmation of human rights anyway, because it affirms human dignity, it affirms humanity. Do you know what I mean? And like if you, for example, have a story about someone who's struggling with the mental health difficulty, and, you know, that is related to human rights, in that, you know, human right, their mental health is a human right, and, you know, that there's lots of avenues into human rights. But like I say, you know, the best art is life affirming, and human rights are invariably kind of entangled with that.
So you take quite a broad view of that.
Absolutely,
then.
Yeah. I should say as well, sorry, in terms of reviewing the submissions, we're committed to diversity and representation, and including artists from all underrepresented backgrounds. And yeah, we will kind of tend towards the human rights and social justice submissions as well, because of who Smashing Times are.
But it's not necessary.
It doesn't. No, it doesn't. It absolutely doesn't have to be at least explicitly related to human rights as a concept.
Unless it's a theme.
Exactly,
I often find that interesting, because, you know, I'm an artist who works in human rights, so I am one part of me is an artist, another part of me is very committed to human rights. I tend to see human rights as something quite human. It's all about, for me, it's about respect and dignity. And I think many, you know, the personal is often the political.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you know, art for me is a way of reflecting on the world and making sense of the world we live in, or you know, exploring the world we live in. And that can be quite broad, and a lot of that is to do with our humanity, which is linked, as you're saying, to our human rights. Yeah. However, I also happen to believe that there should never be an onus on an artist to write about human rights. That if you don't want to, now there's often a debate about this. I know Augusto Boal, the famous Brazilian theatre practitioner, I remember being in a workshop with him one time, and we were debating this or talking about this, that everything is political and that what you write is political, whether you mean it or not. But I tend, and I believe that, I do think that, but I tend myself as well to think that choosing to simply be an artist is a human right. Ironically. You know.
And freedom of expression means you can express your art in whatever topic
Yes.
you decide. You aren't obliged, even living in extremely dark and troubling times like we currently are, where the temptation probably and the pressure is greater. You still aren't obliged to do it. But plenty of artists make their art. They make their art, and it's not to do with political or social issues, but they will separately kind of make statements and be an activist on political issues separately.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And then often I've seen it happen. I won't give examples now, but I've often seen it happen where an artist may be making a piece of work and they don't necessarily label it as human rights, but yet it's profoundly about human rights.
Yeah, definitely.
So that can often happen. So I just think it's really interesting that it's very open, and we're very open to, I think at the end of the day, as an artist, I know myself as an artist, for me it's about a personal connection to the work and making work around something that I'm fascinated by or that I'm drawn to or that troubles me. And that tends to be the first reason why I make art. And it just so happens to sometimes focus around stories, particularly, that often involve human rights. I'm very passionate about telling stories of people who stand up for the rights of others. And I'm drawn to that. But then I'm equally drawn to work about nature and finding a profound spirituality in nature. And you might say, well, where's the human rights in that? But unfortunately, we're facing today the whole idea of respect for the earth.
Exactly.
And that often comes into the work.
Yeah, it's part of human rights, definitely. And the individual's right to kind of be in nature and be amongst nature and not have it all replaced by concrete and metal.
Yeah. And what about yourself as a writer? How does human rights fit into your own work, or does it?
When I started writing, I thought it didn't. But like I said about the mental health example, a lot of what I was writing about was kind of my own mental health and I suppose confessional poetry, which is tied into human rights. But it later, more recently, it has developed a more kind of social element to it and a kind of outwards focus. Like another novel I've recently started or I started a while back and put on the back burner, but I will finish it, is to do with, the protagonist in it. He visits a lot of different European countries and the narrative explores the pasts of those countries. For example, in Croatia, the Yugoslav wars are explored. So in terms of remembrance of, I suppose, human atrocities, in that they're human atrocities and things like that. So remembrance would be a big focus in my poetry as well. Absolutely, remembrance of those who have suffered, survivors of atrocities, but also probably more often the kind of victims, and the great tragedy of those who lose their lives in atrocities amongst thousands of others. And there's never even a chance to kind of individually remember and honor them. And so I suppose sometimes, you take a great atrocity where hundreds or thousands of people were murdered and you tell one person's story in it and you kind of, in some way, imaginatively commemorate this person and restore some kind of dignity to this person who has been wronged.
And I know you had a poem, you might remind me the name of it. It was inspired by the life story of Mary Elmes, who was an Irish woman who was involved in the Second World War, saving people from I suppose Nazi-occupied Europe. And you wrote a poem inspired by her life, but linked it to the atrocities that are happening in Palestine and the current genocide today.
The Malaga-Almeria Road Massacre of 1937 during the Spanish Civil War, where Franco's forces just slaughtered the civilians of the city, a city that was aligned with the opposing side, the Republican side in the Civil War. Yeah, compared that with present-day Gaza, the genocide. Well, I suppose you could say it's still happening, but it was definitely still in full swing when I wrote that in 2024. It's called Untitled 5. Okay. Yeah, it's a long poem.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary piece, I have to say. It's an anti-war poem.
Anti-war,
I would say very much as an anti-war poem. So we're going to take a short break.
It is great to be on Dublin South 93.9 FM.
Broadcasting to South Dublin on 93.9. This is Dublin South FM.
Welcome back to the Smashing Times Arts and Human Rights radio show. I am delighted to have in studio with me Féilim James, who is a writer and editor of Tintreach, the Smashing Times Arts and Literary Journal, and he's also editor of the Smashing Times monthly newsletter. And Féilim is here talking about his own work as a writer and about Tintreach. So, Féilim, we were talking about, you're inviting artists from many different art forms to apply, whether you're a new artist or a more experienced artist. What are the common pitfalls when people submit? Maybe talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I will quickly just say that we had submissions window open in February. That was for the upcoming April edition, which is edition 6 of Tintreach. And then in May, we will have submissions window open again for the July edition, which under the theme of Voices of Peace, Part 2. So just so people are aware, if you want to submit, go to smashingtimes.ie /Tintreach, Tintreach. So yeah, the common pitfalls depends on the art form, but I think sometimes in short fiction, I would be reading a really strong story, and then it suddenly just ends abruptly, and you're like, okay, well the shape of the narrative isn't intact here, and it's kind of a big job to go back to the monastum to continue writing this that time kind of doesn't allow usually. So it's a shame when I have to reject those ones. Then in terms of poetry, I've said this before, like I think, you can't just write down what you're thinking or like make social political points and then think that it's poetry.
Well, maybe you can, depends on how well it's written.
I think it needs to be elevated into poetry by, like beautiful use of language or something, or like, an inventive rhyme scheme. Like I can't sit down right here now and just write down what's on my mind, write a stream of consciousness and say, okay, there's a poem, no need for editing, but you know what I'm saying? But unless, for example, you elevate it using a particularly original stream of consciousness writing style that, speaks to the stream of consciousness kind of tradition, you know what I mean? Like, so, yeah. So there's that, and then just repetitive rhyme schemes like ABAB, AABB. I find those particularly uninspiring. So, yeah. Yeah.
I think that's interesting now because they're your own personal. Now, I know there is a panel often picking the artworks, which I think is important because it raises the question, I suppose, of subjectivity
Yes.
and objectivity that I've often found it very interesting that many people can describe, for example, poetry in many different ways. And what one person might see as a poem, somebody else mightn't. But it is definitely up to I often think up to the writer and up to the receiver of the art, or the person who's enjoying or reflecting on the art.
Yeah, sorry, I should clarify that. Sorry, like it's still poetry. I don't believe in this snobbery around, that's not poetry.
Yeah, definitely.
It just might be, in my own particular eyes, like not poetry of a particularly high order. The subjectivity objectivity thing is interesting. Sometimes I hear people saying, "Oh, well, art is subjective," as if it's 100% subjective. And they were like, okay, so why are some works forgotten and some are celebrated as great? Like, clearly there is an objective element to it. There's also the subjective element as well. But I would say that personally, I think the objective element is probably slightly in the majority.
Now, you've probably lost me there, Féilim.
No, because in terms of like artistic technique and, the things that, for example, in any narrative form, like a film, play or novel, an interesting story, a story that has a good shape to it, with the usual factors like catalyst and rising action, falling action, and climax, and resolution, stuff like that. Things like that naturally do help. They've been used since like the time of the
elements
ancient
of
Greeks.
Structure.
Yes, they help, and.
But I often think and again, it can be very different. We often say, I know myself and Frida and Smashing Times, when we were talking about art, we often talk about where a piece of art just touches us emotionally, when it engages our emotions. That's definitely...
Yeah, that's a massive part of it too. As
well,
I think.
That's when it tends to work. And that often comes across regardless of the style sometimes that a person uses. Or sometimes, I know myself as a writer, you often find the style changes depending on what the emotion is that's coming through.
Absolutely.
That you put into the work.
And when there is that emotional core to a work, if there are some kind of issues with the style or just issues, like they can be sorted out, they can be edited, they can be fine-tuned, and then you can, like, as long as, in that case, the most important thing is there, like, or one of the most important things, that emotional core.
Yeah. So there is that openness then to I often think this myself when you're reading new work, recognising that there's something there.
Yes.
And it has a journey
definitely,
to go on, you know. And, it's interesting when you talk about, I remember as a writer myself, at one point, I write poetry and I sometimes fail them. I might be one of those writers that do, AV, or those types of structures. I find sometimes it suits my work.
Yeah. It has a place.
Yeah.
Definitely, yeah.
But I remember one time writing several pieces of poetry, which I was very surprised where they came from. They were part of my Feeling Soul series. And they literally were streams of consciousness. And I ended up with several pieces. And I actually questioned, is this poetry? And I remember being shocked afterwards by thinking, how could I question that? And that again gets back to the self-belief in your work as an artist. They ended up, I think they're some of my very powerful pieces. They're very personal. I've used them in my exhibitions, and they're part of the Stargazer Whispers, which would be my poetry collection. And I found that style worked just as well. You know, there's no rhyming in it, but it's still poetry or poetical text.
Yeah, but I imagine you kind of did a few round of edits on it.
Well, I tend to. You know, what do they say?
Yeah, but that's the thing. Yeah, no, I'm not saying that you can't just sit down and pour out something good. But if we literally transcribe our thoughts, and it's probably more opinions than thoughts. You know, like art isn't opinion.
Yeah,
poetry is not just opinion. You know, we might completely agree with everything you're saying, you know, as regards to some of the horrible things going on in the world, but it doesn't necessarily.
It's the aesthetic and the poetical impact.
It's lacking in the aesthetic.
Yeah.
Side of things.
Well, you know, I remember I trained with Deirdre O'Connell of the Focus Theatre in Dublin, and I always remember Deirdre. She used to repeat this all the time. Heaven preserve us from concepts.
Heaven preserve us
from concepts
good,
that she often used to repeat. No, she was very much into, you know, it's the human connection and the human relationship and the humanity in the art.
Definitely.
And in the script.
Especially in theatre.
Yeah, that's in theatre.
All of our forms.
Yeah,
especially.
Definitely. Okay, so maybe go back and talk a little about this next call. So the current submission window has closed, and there will be a new submission window opening in May. You were saying?
Yes, it'll be open for the month of May. Yeah.
And that's Voices of Peace artists. Maybe just talk a little bit more about that and about what you'll be looking for.
Yeah, so it's part two because. You know, we're kind of intending for it to be a series, and the first part of it, the first iteration of the series was last July with Voices of Peace. So yeah, it's just whatever the theme Voices of Peace inspires for you. But I suppose especially in terms of the socio-political kind of socially conscious element, because the successful artists will become Voices of Peace artists at the festival again, and it's Arts and Human Rights, the Irish Arts and Human Rights Festival. So, you know, work is especially welcome, I suppose, that's writing about ongoing events in the world, of which there are many. And
but they can be events from the past or today.
Absolutely. They can be events of the past.
Or as you were saying, it could be personal or political or a mixture.
Yeah.
It's
the one thing is that you can't be promoting war, you know, there should absolutely be a kind of a peace-seeking element to it, I suppose. Well, doesn't necessarily have to be, but just don't be promoting war. I can't really imagine anyone sending me a poem promoting war, but you never know. There were plenty of them doing it before World War I, getting all the lads to sign up.
Yeah, we must look at that actually. That's interesting.
Yeah.
You know, and again, I'm quoting Boal a lot today, the Brazilian theatre practitioner. He was the creator of Theatre of the Oppressed, using the arts to explore oppression in people's lives. And promoting empowerment. But I remember one time him talking about building walls. It's not quite the same, but it just reminded me of that. And he said we have to start building walls against racism, building walls against sexism, and maybe building walls against war. How do you do that? And this idea of resistance, because resistance is active. You can resist war, and is that a form of peace? Your resistance.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, resistance can. You know, you need, in order to be a pacifist or a promoter of peace during wartime, you know, that involves that involves resistance. You know, a special kind of resistance. There's many types of resistance. It doesn't inherently have to be physical force. You know, you can have civil disobedience, kind of Gandhi style, Martin Luther King style. There's lots of different. Yeah. I like the word resistance as well. And then it also has connotations in terms of the resistance during World War II, who, you know, no one could argue they weren't on the right side of history,
Yeah. But again, it's that choice, isn't it? Do you resist violently or non-violently?
I mean,
And I'm definitely,
difficult when
my own personal opinion is to resist non-violently, and it's non-violence.
yeah, but if you're going to be obliterated if you don't take up arms, in the most extreme examples,
Yeah, well, that debate is going on in the world today, isn't it? What do you do when the invader is coming in? And,
Yeah,
the right to take up arms and self-defence. And yet, it's easy for someone who's not in a war situation to turn and say, well,
yeah,
I don't believe in violence and it must be peaceful. Although I definitely don't think violence is the response to violence.
I mean, violence, no matter when it's happening, and no matter how it might be justified in terms of legitimate self-defense, it's always a tragedy because human beings are hurting other human beings, and that's. I mean, for me personally, that just always makes me sad. It's just grim,
Yeah, but in terms of submissions, it's wide open.
Absolutely,
and it's interesting. Yeah. There are many artists who support war and would support that.
Are there
right?
these days, though? Are there?
Well,
I suppose
that's something I'm going to go and look up or look into after this. Interesting enough. And anything else, any other advice you'd give to artists now for? So voices of peace, and you're looking for artists. But I also think it's worth mentioning that when artists who submit for Tintreach as voices of peace artists, there is the opportunity to be involved in the annual Irish Arts and Human Rights Festival.
I should elaborate upon that. So that would, we haven't hashed out all the details yet, but if it follows the same format as last year, it would just involve, pending availability, speaking at an event at the festival.
Yeah.
And
being interviewed on this radio show, the opportunity to talk about your work.
To be interviewed on the radio show, yes.
Yeah.
And of course, an artist fee as well.
Yeah, that there is our artist fees paid. It's interesting. And you as a writer, do you submit your work to other art literary journals?
Of course I do, yeah.
And how do you find that process?
Difficult because most are rejections. And that's the
Very
same.
honest of you.
Same, no, but it's the same for most artists who haven't had their first book published yet. It's I submit to journals, I submit to publishers, I submit to literary agents, I submit to competitions. Yes, and most are rejections, but you just have to. It's another area where you just have to be tough to be an artist. I think artists are sometimes seen by society at large and people who aren't involved in the arts as soft, as maybe kind of spongers. But I mean, you have to be tough. You have to be tough to do this. That's completely inaccurate. But
yeah, absolutely not.
Yeah, they should try it.
Yes. I do think, and I often say this to artists, yes, it can be difficult, and I think we need much more support for the arts. I really want to call for, we need more funding for the arts, we need more visibility for the arts. I was talking to somebody recently who was telling me they used to work with Pash Machine, where Brendan Gleeson was involved, and apparently I think it was Brendan Gleeson who had the idea that why doesn't the news, like RTE, provide a slot for arts programmes and artists the same way that they provide a slot for sport. So every time RTE has the news on, whether it's the morning news, the afternoon or evening news, and you've got a slot for sport, can you please put in a slot for the arts? That would be a game changer for the arts in Ireland. Somebody mentioned, I think they're starting to do that in countries like Spain, but that is something this show would like to put out a call to RTE and to other television and radio stations. Please provide slots for the arts
because it's like,
as well as sport.
Sometimes they do entertainment, but that's kind of like showbiz and might also involve...
Which is a part of the arts.
Yeah, except when it's about who's broken up with who and stuff. And it's like, well, you could actually be, spotlighting some up-and-coming
that's kind of gossip on the arts.
Play, you know what I mean? But I don't think
Well, it's also
RTE
about the art
like
itself and the work of artists, because there's some fantastic. There is some fantastic work happening around the country in terms of arts and around the world.
Yeah, art versus celebrity, less of the celebrity stuff.
We're going to come to the end of this interview now. So I was going to ask you, how do you think the arts are doing and what changes you'd like to see? But before I do that, to finish up, any other words that you'd like to offer for Tintreach? Just to say, keep an eye on smashingtimes.ie for the next open call.
Website I gave earlier, smashingtimes.ie /Tintreach.
Perfect.
We'd love to have your submissions, and we're really grateful for every submission we get.
Perfect. Okay, and Féilim, and what do you think? What changes would you like to see in the arts in the future?
I think the Irish, by comparison to other countries, I think the Irish arts sector is doing quite well, and obviously we're pioneering the basic income for the arts scheme.
Yes.
But just because we're doing better than other countries doesn't mean there's not room for improvement. I think basic income for the arts scheme should be expanded to include more artists. And I think there should be more funding for smaller arts organisations so that they can survive and thrive. Smaller literary journals as well, because without these, the art world isn't the same. So yeah, that's what I'd like to see. But we're definitely going in the right direction, I think.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much, Féilim, for coming on our show today, and we wish you the very best of luck with your writing and with Tintreach, the Smashing Times Arts and Literary Journal, and with the Smashing Times newsletter as well. I believe the next issue is on arts and philosophy.
Philosophy and the arts.
Philosophy
yes,
and the arts.
Thursday,
Brilliant.
2nd of April.
Okay. And you can access the journal, and I think there's going to be a paywall around the journal going forward.
Yes,
Would that be correct?
they're from July onwards, I think.
Okay,
there might be
something for people to note. I think that's the case with a lot of arts journals.
it's out of necessity,
Yeah.
really. I mean, we've done well to go without the paywall for a while.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's going
Cool.
forward.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of the Smashing Times Arts and Human Rights radio show on Dublin South FM. A special thank you to Féilim James, our guest today, to Luke, our sound engineer, and to Smashing Times and Dublin South FM. Thank you.